Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Danny Gagné, and I am the coordinator of the Observatory on, Multidimensional Conflicts of the Cher Raoul-Dandurand. Our observatory was created in 2019 with the mission statement of raising awareness towards cybersecurity, as well as to stimulate the creation of a much-needed academic expertise on the subject. Since our inception, we have been addressing the strategic risks that countries such as Canada are facing in this new battlefield. This is precisely, of course, why we are here today. In 2016, the American electoral process was disturbed by Russian foreign influence campaign in which disinformation was spread on social media in the hope of stirring unrest among within the population, the American population. On January 6, 2021, of course, an angry mob stormed the Capitol building, and some of the participants were radicalized on social media, using, in which disinformation, such as what we have observed in 2016, played, of course, a significant role. With the midterm elections in just a couple of days, the United States are at a crossroads. So now can we observe foreign influence in the upcoming elections? What are the risks that the United States are facing, and what could be the aftermath of this election? So that are the questions we are going to try and answer today. Before going any further, I would like to thank all the people who made this conference possible. Thanks to our executive director, Louis Collerette, Ivana Potex, head of communications, Françoise Conea, who made this conference possible, my fellow researcher, Mr. Alexis Rapin, Frédéric Gagnon, president of the Observatory, who unfortunately could not be with us today. I would like to thank, of course, our flagship, the Cher Raoul-Dandurand. The Cher will organize similar events in the next couple of days. I would like to thank the CORIM, the Conseil des Relations Internationales de Montréal, for partnering with us to diffuse the information on this event. And of course, at last but not least, I would like to thank Dr. Bilyana Lilly, who accepted our invitation and made it all the way from California to be with us this afternoon. So thank you, Bilyana. Dr. Lilly is the author of the book Russian Information Warfare, which she will be talking about today, as well as the director of Security Intelligence and Geostrategy as the Krebs Stamos Group. Dr. Lilly is a leader on cybersecurity and information warfare with over 15 years of managerial, technical, and research experience. Dr. Lilly helps boards and senior executives to make strategic decisions while accounting for evolving cyber and geopolitical risks. She's a mentor and speaker at DefCon, CyCon, the Executive Women's Forum, and the Warsaw Security Forum. She has worked at the United Nations, Deloitte, and the RAND Corporation. She is also the author of the book Russia's Foreign Policy Towards Missile Defense. She has a PhD and 3 master's degree, including a master's degree from the University of Oxford, which awarded her with a distinction. And finally, she has, I think we can say, the honor. She has been denounced by Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, Dr. Lilly, once more, thank you very much for being here today. I'm sure the public is eager to hear about your book and your research interests. So with no further ado, I give you Dr. Bilyana Lilly.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Awesome. So, Danny, thank you for this awesome introduction, and I'm really glad to be here. It's my first time in Canada, and I've loved what I've seen so far. So thank you for having me. The topic today is the interference, or what types of interference we could expect against the 2020 US elections. And my expertise has been on Russian interference, but I'm more than happy to talk about other nation states that are likely to interfere in the elections and the information that we already have about China and Iran. And Danny, perhaps we could cover this in the Q&A afterwards. But I will focus on Russian interference, and because I wrote a book on this and I've been working on this topic for about 6 years now. And this is the structure of the presentation for today. I will first talk a little bit about what is Russia's doctrine of a foreign policy doctrine that enables Russia to conduct the activities that against the election infrastructure and against different targets in the West. And that doctrine, according to Russian documents, is the doctrine of information warfare. And I'll quickly define it for you because it will show us what types of activities the Russian government is capable of enacting or launching against Western states. Then I will show you a few examples of how the Russian government has operationalized that doctrine on the ground. And in my book that Danny mentioned, I looked at 7 cases of Russian interference, or 7 cases of Russian information warfare. And here I will cover 3. I will cover the interference in the US elections in 2016. I will cover the Russian interference in the French elections in 2017, and in Norway in 2016. Some of the cases that I won't have time to cover today, unfortunately, but are also very interesting, are Russia's interference against Montenegro, Russia's interference against Bulgaria and Estonia, which are cases that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A as well if you're interested. Then one of the popular topics of the day, and unfortunately, is Russia's interference in Ukraine. So I will briefly summarize for you what types of cyber operations and narratives, specifically disinformation, we have seen in Ukraine. And then I will conclude with what all of this tells us about potential interference in the 2020 elections. And of course, this is my best educated guess based on my knowledge of Russia's past activities and Russia's operations in Ukraine. So I'm also open to discussing this in the Q&A and happy to answer your questions afterwards. So the first point, what is Russian information warfare? There are a few documents, official documents, where Russia mentions this term, but the one where the Russian government provides the clearest definition, and you'll see it's still very, very short actually, of the term is a document from 2011 that is called the Concept on Activities in the Information Space. The Russian government doesn't use the word cyberspace. They use information space. For them, this is roughly equivalent to what the US would call cyberspace. And in that document, the Russian government explains that information war or information warfare is the confrontation between 2 or more states in the information space. This is all they're saying about the definition, with regards to the definition. And then they proceed by showing or explaining what the purposes of information warfare are. And I think this is really important because when we talk about information warfare, some scholars tend to focus on cyber. Some scholars tend to focus on disinformation operations. But actually, in Russia's mindset, those 2 are integrated in the same concept. And this is important because the doctrine integrates the 2 together, or talks about the 2 together. Then you have the departments and the military and the government that also work on those concepts at once. And in the US, for example, in US doctrine, and then respectively in the way the US organizations and institutions or agencies are structured, you have different agencies responsible for those 2 separately. And I think it is important that we start thinking about them as integrated in one concept, because the approach would be very different. So here, the purposes of information warfare that the Russian government outlines are the following. The first is to inflict damage to information systems. And then the second, third, and fourth all pertain to having cognitive effects. So the second is to undermine the political, economic, and social systems of the adversary. The third is to conduct massive psychological manipulation of the population to destabilize the state and society. And the final is to coerce the state to make decisions for the benefit of the opposing force. So you can see here, the first one is only to actually have some sort of technical effects or to cause technical disruption. All the other 3 are to have psychological effect. And an important point here is that that psychological effect is aimed not only at the decision makers of a particular population. It is actually aimed at the entire population, which means every single one of us can be a target of Russian information warfare. So how is that actually operationalized on the ground? So we could say that we look at that concept, it's pretty abstract. And there are a lot of Russian military scholars that talk about the specific activities that would be enabled for this doctrine. And the two main ones, based on scholarship of Russian experts, are cyber operations, which are conducted through the information space, and the second is psychological operations that include disinformation. The term that I tend to use here, and lots of scholars use disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, influence operations, and all of those. I use the term strategic messaging. And I use that term because that's the term that Russian military scholars use, or some Russian military scholars use, and because that term includes disinformation, but is not only limited to disinformation. Because in some cases, and we'll see the case of the US elections in 2016, the Russian government doesn't really have to present fake news to influence the population. The information that the Russian government can try to advocate for and spread through different social networks can be completely accurate. But still, the benefit or the purpose of that information is to basically erode our own trust in democracy. So here, I would say that the two main elements through which Russia conducts information warfare are cyber operations and strategic messaging. And then we have also others that are associated components, which include economic coercion, diplomatic coercion, and others. And in order to synthesize all of those and be able to analyze every single case in a more standardized way, I created a framework that I called CHAOS. And CHAOS stands for Cyber, Hype in Media, and Associated Operations. And you can see what types of associated operations I list there. Basically, with CHAOS, I try to create a framework that we can apply to every single case of Russian interference, not only election interference, but information warfare campaigns in general. And using a simple framework like this will help us to standardize the way we talk about every single case study and will enable us to compare and contrast between different cases. And why is that helpful? Because by applying this framework to the 7 cases that I applied it to in my book, but also others afterwards, I see where the Russian government has used more aggressive measures. I see what the sequence of activities that the Russian government has used has been across different cases. And I can figure out where the critical junctures are, how the cases vary, and where we can apply effective policies to actually counter the effects of information warfare campaigns. So this framework, I'm going to show you how I applied it to 3 cases. And those are the case of the US 2016 elections, French elections in 2017, and then in Norway. And for example, in the US elections, what do we know about the 2016 interference? We know now that there was two Russian state-sponsored threat actors or advanced persistent threats, basically cyber groups, that infiltrated the network of the Democratic National Committee, or the DNC in the United States, and also breached the emails of quite a few of the campaign members of Hillary Clinton's campaign, and as a result, leaked strategically information that they obtained through those breaches as the election was taking place, or the election campaign was taking place. And the information that they released was not necessarily fake. It was a lot of accurate information about Hillary Clinton's campaign, about conflicts within the campaign, about the fact that she had the questions for certain campaign debates or political debates in advance. So all of that information was accurate, but it was sensitive and it was released to the public. In addition to that, we also know that the Russian government sponsored or had a whole troll factory in St. Petersburg, the IRA or the Internet Research Agency, from where Russians faked to be Americans and started publishing or proliferating all sorts of narratives through Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and other platforms that were either critical of actually either candidate, so they were not always positive of Trump, sometimes they were critical of President Trump as well, but they also spread a lot of narratives that were very much divisive and particularly sensitive to the population at that time. They talked about police brutality, they talked about immigration, and all other topics. And in addition to those strategic narratives and sometimes disinformation that spread through social media, we also had Russian state-sponsored media, RT and Sputnik, spreading a lot of the messages around the elections. And The final point I wanted to mention here is that the Russian government also sponsored a number of rallies throughout the United States during this period. So this is how I use the chaos framework to map the Russian interference against the 2016 US elections. You can see first government activities. Those are the activities that were conducted by Russia's state-sponsored hackers because they worked for Russian military intelligence, so they were government actors. Here you can see social activities, which were the number of rallies that were conducted by social actors. We call them unwitting participants. This is one term to use. There are some more pejorative ones, but I'll stick to this one for the purposes of this presentation. Those rallies were actually done by Americans, but they were sponsored by Russians sitting in St. Petersburg and other places pretending to be Americans, and they even sent funding to the Americans to sponsor the rallies. So then we have a number of events that might have influenced Russia's behavior, including the election day. And here we have the volume of media coverage published in Russian state-sponsored media and aired in the United States about the two candidates per day. So here I'm trying to basically quantify Russia's strategic messaging during the election period or this particular information warfare campaign. And on the bottom we have the main stages of the cyber operations that were sponsored by Russian cyber state actors or Russian state-sponsored actors. What is also interesting here is this area with the light blue on the x-axis. This is the number of articles in Russian state-sponsored media that pertained to the information that was released from the DNC hack. So in the States, we call this a hack and leak operation. Well, this is how the hack and leak operation feeds into the strategic messaging operation. So you can see here the integration between the cyber operations and the strategic messaging campaign of the Russian government. And I think quantifying this can show you basically how the two work together. But also, another interesting fact that this figure shows you is that after election day, the volume of media coverage about the two candidates doesn't decrease. It actually increases immediately after the election day and afterwards with regards to the average, the overall volume. Why is this important? Because in Russian information warfare doctrine, the doctrine doesn't say that the confrontation between two states is periodic. It says that the confrontation can be continuous. And this also shows you that the elections are only one event that the Russian government is exploiting, and that the main objective of the election or of Russia's interference during the election may not be to elect one candidate over the other. It may be to just make sure that we're divided, that our trust in our democratic system is eroded, and especially after the election where half of the population is still outraged because their candidate didn't win, the Russian government is trying to capitalize on those grievances and divide us further. And to take this to the extreme, one of the scenarios that the Russian government may be trying to actually create is another January 6th scenario, similar to what happened this year on January the 6th. Because the narrative after the election was about corruption in the election system, about Hillary Clinton, about Donald Trump, and there were even rallies sponsored after the election about for and against both candidates. So the point here might have been to try to basically create a social insurrection or increase the chances of social instability in the country. So with regards to the effects of this whole information warfare campaign, many people still debate to this day, did Putin decide the 2016 election? I would say no one can tell us for sure, even today, because we haven't really methodologically examined how much of the information that was released through the DNC hack and all that media, all the strategic messaging that spread through social media, how much did it really influence voters? Did it change the minds of that many voters that it actually resulted in a different election outcome? So we can't really decide on that. We can't really conclusively say yes or no to this question. That's why I have under election outcome a question mark, because we don't know. But there are still other benefits from the perspective of the Russian government that the Russian government accomplished through this particular interference. For example, the DNC chairwoman, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, resigned as a result of the Russian interference in the DNC. Also, more than 130 million users saw Russia's messages on different social media platforms. We also have quite a significant reputational damage for the political candidates, especially for Hillary Clinton. But with regards to the negative aspects or the costs for the Russian government as a result of their interference. There were indictments and sanctions. I would say the indictments don't really have much of an effect. They're more symbolic because if we indict a number of Russian hackers or other individuals, we put them on a list, we say that they're not allowed to come to the United States, they will be prosecuted if they come to the States, or we basically name them, but they can still be in Russia and out of reach, and they can never, we can never really follow through on that, on those threats. But it's still a symbolic gesture that those people now are listed on indictments. Then we have election infrastructure marked as critical by CISA, the DHS department responsible for critical infrastructure. They created a whole category for election infrastructure is critical in January 2017 as a result of the hack. And more funding from the government as a result has been focused on election infrastructure and protecting it as a result of Russia's interference. And also, we just are very much more aware of Russia's threat. And since 2016, I would say on the government and the private sector side, there are a number of policies that have been introduced to make sure that the Russian interference in 2016 doesn't repeat. And I would say there's a lot more room for improvement, but we have been very successful at identifying some of Russia's main channels of influence and making sure that we stop them in the future. So very quickly, Danny, how much more time do I have?
Still have a lot?
I do? Okay, awesome.
So 10 minutes, maybe?
I can do 10 minutes, thank you. So let's see another case. So the Russian government, I would say overall, thought that the 2016 interference was successful from the perspective of the Kremlin. And another main point that I should mention here, now that I realize I have a little time to do that, is Russia's concept of great power. To the Russian government, although there were a number of indictments and other costs that followed as a result of Russia's interference, the fact that the Russian government was in the news for so long is a win for Putin. Because for years, the Russian government, and there's a lot of scholarship on this, has been trying to portray itself as equal to the United States. And they list quite a few different elements for that: culture and their involvement in the Second World War and victory from there. And they also list nuclear weapons as one of the platforms or the domains in which they are on par with the United States. So the fact that we talked about Russia's interference in the elections for so long really elevated their status as a bad actor, as a villain in foreign policy. But negative publicity is still publicity, and I would say in the eyes of President Putin, that is a win for the country. So, France, 2017. Well, the French had elections, if you remember, very much a few months after, just a few months after the United States. And the Russian government tried to recreate their success from the 2016 elections in the 2017 elections in France. We had President Macron, who was then a candidate for the presidency, and we had him compete against Le Pen, who was the leader of the National Front Party in France. The Front National Party, I think, yeah, was the main party that was competing against Macron's party on March. And we have clear evidence that Le Pen's party was sponsored by the Russian government. So the Russian government had very much interest in making sure that Le Pen wins the election. There were several financial transactions from a Russian bank to Le Pen's party before the elections, and we know that the two leaders have also communicated. So Macron and Macron's presidential campaign was very much aware that they may face similar interference from the Russian government, so they took measures in advance, and kudos to them for doing so. They made sure to train their staff on basically to provide cyber training and awareness to their staff members. They made sure not to communicate anything sensitive via email, but to have phone calls and in-person discussions on topics that were sensitive to the campaign. They also made sure to include fake information or false information in their emails and on their networks, because in fact the Russian government did manage to breach the networks of the Macron campaign, but the information that they found was not as salacious as the information that was found during the DNC hack or as a result of the DNC hack in the 2016 US elections. So Macron, the presidential campaign of President Macron, then candidate Macron, made sure to be prepared for a potential Russian breach on multiple levels. So when the Russians breached their networks of the On March campaign and then released some of the information didn't really spread on social media or national media or Russian state-sponsored media as much as it did in the 2016 US elections. And we have here just the chronology of the major cyber operation at the time and the volume of the media coverage. But here you see the percentage or the proportion of the strategic messaging in Russian state-sponsored media that pertains to the Macron leaks. They were called Macron leaks at the time. Basically, the information that was taken from the Macron hack was very small in comparison to what it was in the United States. So the same strategic messaging and the same pattern and operation that seemed to have worked better in the US didn't really work in France. We also had the Macron campaign was very also well prepared to counter disinformation narratives or strategic messaging in general from the Russian government. The moment there was some fake fact or information about Macron, him or a member of his campaign or other representatives would immediately counter that narrative. So they were very quick with responding and identifying disinformation as well, which it's proven has worked in many cases and is a way to counter disinformation. So in this particular case, we could say that the Russian operation wasn't as successful. What is also interesting in this case to see here is that there was information about the Macron leaks, and in general, the volume of strategic messaging about the campaign continued after the election, which also shows you here, similarly to the previous case, that information warfare from the Russian government is conducted continuously. So, was this a successful campaign? Probably not so much based on my research. Also, RT and Sputnik, which are Russia's two main state-sponsored media, were designated as organs of influence here. There is even a wonderful video. Whenever I feel like we can do better or I feel down, I actually watch it. It's President Macron is at a press conference next to President Putin, and I don't think President Putin was prepared to hear this. I don't think Macron told him he's going to do this in advance, because they're next to each other and they're on film. You can probably see this on Twitter or YouTube. And President Macron says, RT and Sputnik are organs of influence. He literally says it on the mic next to President Putin, and President Putin doesn't respond. He didn't know what to do. So this was basically a very good example of how directly President Macron identified Russian state-sponsored media as organs of influence in front of the entire population in public. So we also, as I mentioned, there were no really salacious details from the leaked information that the Russians leaked from the Macron campaign. There was no known significant social media campaign the way it happened in the United States, and Macron won the election. So overall, I would say that's pretty much a failure for the Russian government. The last case that I wanted to show you, and this is my favorite case, and few people have heard about it exactly because this is what chaos looks in this particular case. There was one hack operation, basically hack and leak, just the hack part of hack and leak, because the Russian state-sponsored hackers hacked the Labour Party in Norway, and then they didn't release any information. They didn't do anything else. There were no protests, no rallies. There wasn't even a disinformation operation at the time. And I love this case because the Russians tried to start disinformation campaigns. They actually opened up Sputnik Nord, which is a Norwegian version of Russia's state-sponsored media Sputnik. But the Norwegians did not at all believe the narratives in Sputnik Nord. They actually laughed at them, they shared them as a joke, and a few months later the Russian government decided to just close the outlet because it wasn't working there. So I would say the Norwegians are a great case study to examine further, and specifically to look at why is it that in Norway Russia's information warfare campaigns aren't as successful as they are in other cases. And I think that, at least from what I have read, and I think if you have researchers, master's students, PhD students that are looking for topics to explore, I'll definitely focus on Norway and try to understand why are the Norwegians so good at countering information warfare. Some of the reasons that I have seen in the literature are that the Norwegians are very well educated. They're taught to be skeptical consumers of information very early on in their life, already in high schools. And also, the level of corruption in Norway is pretty low. And one of the ways in which the Russian government manages to influence different countries is through sponsoring political parties, for sponsoring social media, for sponsoring actual media on the ground, journalists. And those operations aren't really possible in Norway, or those channels of influence aren't really possible in Norway, because the Norwegians are very transparent with their funding, very transparent with their contacts in relation to or in comparison to other countries. So, okay, let's talk about Ukraine. Ukraine 2022. What are the types of cyber operations and strategic narratives that we're seeing there? Before we focus on that, I just want to pause and mention, Norway is the very first large-scale war that is happening on European territory since World War II. And this is incredibly important. The barbaric activities that we've seen there, the war crimes, they're absolutely unspeakable. And what I'm going to focus on right now, the information domain, is only one aspect of this entire horrible, horrible war that is happening in Ukraine. So what are we seeing in cyberspace and the information space from the perspective of the Russians? We have a number of cyber operations that have already taken place, and we're still learning about what types of effects those cyber operations have had, even what they have been, because the war is still ongoing. But we know from Viktor Zhora, who is the head of cybersecurity in Ukraine, that there have been at least 1,600 major cyber incidents since the beginning of this year. And we also have an increased number or incidents of very disruptive and disruptive cyber operations against Ukrainian targets. And those specifically include DDoS, data wiping attacks, and we have espionage campaigns, but the data wiping attacks and the DDoS attacks are the most disruptive types. And we have specifically data wiping attacks, a number of new malware families that have been used against Ukrainian targets, and some of them have also spilled over to other countries, including Germany. So that's one of the issues why we should be paying attention to the war, because of the potential for spillover effects. With regards to disinformation campaigns, there have been so many different narratives about Zelensky having left the country, about Zelensky being incapacitated or being sick, about Ukrainians being Nazis, and you name it. But the ones that I think are important for us to pay attention to, because we could see similar types of operations against our countries, are the operations where the Russians have used basically unite cyber operations and disinformation. It's almost like a hack and leak operations, but I call them actually hack and demoralize. Because, for example, I give you two examples here. The Russians first have hacked Facebook accounts of Ukrainian commanders, and without saying that it's the Russians, they have used the accounts to spread information to the soldiers that they should surrender. So they've used the hack, basically breaching the networks of the accounts, the Facebook accounts of the commanders, and then through them leak disinformation to very strategically to soldiers. Another example is when the Russians hacked 2 radio stations in Ukraine. And again, they didn't say that it was the Russians behind the narratives, but they spread the information that Zelensky was sick. So imagine you're a soldier on the battlefield and you know how important Zelensky has become for this war. President Zelensky is literally like the icon of the war at the moment. And you're fighting on the battlefield and you hear that he's hospitalized. What will happen to your will to fight? If I were a soldier on the battlefield at that point, I will probably be very much disturbed. We still don't have information or studies on how those narratives have affected the soldiers. It's an ongoing war. It's really hard to go into field research if you're an academic there at the moment. But I would suspect that the effects could be very significant. So those are the types of operations we have seen. From all of that, what can we expect during the 2022 US elections? Well, it is my educated guess, but first we can also discuss this, and with Danny and the team, we spoke about this earlier. Are we even to expect cyber operations against US elections or any sort of disinformation narratives? Because the Russian government is very much distracted right now, or not distracted, but rather focused on Ukraine. They care about making sure that they continue the war in Ukraine, but also they have a lot of domestic constituencies to focus on, because there's a lot of opposition, as we have heard, from different groups in Russia who are opposed to the war. So maybe they're really strained with regards to resources. Maybe they don't really have the resources to even launch a sustained campaign against US elections at the moment. I would say to that, it's everyone's guess. I would say yes, this is true, but I think the Russian government still has an opportunity and has a lot of interest in trying to influence the elections to make sure, specifically to make sure, that Republicans win this time. Because there are a number of Republicans who are questioning the way the US is supporting the Ukraine war and the aid that the US is sending. So it will be in Russia's interest to ensure that those people that are skeptical of how aid is being spent and being distributed, that those people gain power, because they may eventually stall US support to Ukraine. And that right now is priority number one for the Russian government. So because of that, I think there is a chance that the Russians are going to try to influence the 2020 elections. So the types of operations that we're likely to see. Well, based on what I talked to you about specifically with regards to Ukraine and what we've seen there, I do think that we can see more disruptive cyber operations. In 2016, we saw a hack and leak operation. This is considered more as a confidentiality attack, basically an attack that results in compromising the confidentiality of data. But we didn't have disruptive attacks against infrastructure. But we have seen now quite a lot of disruptive attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. And I think we could see something similar in the United States as well. Also, Mandiant recently released a report where they showed how Russian GRU cyber threat groups or military intelligence hackers are also working with so-called hacktivists. And the boundary there is always murky. When we say non-state actors or hacktivists who are supposedly not working on behalf of the Russian government or are not on the Russian government payroll, we describe them as hacktivists, but in Russia and in the Russian context, it's very hard to say where the boundary is, because it is known or it's suspected by a lot of researchers, including myself, that even the hacktivists that are supposedly not working for the government are very much under the government's control. So we could say so-called hacktivists, and Mandiant has demonstrated how, or shown in a few case studies or a few campaigns that they discovered, that the Russian clearly state-sponsored cyber threat groups are also working with hacktivists now. Maybe because they want to obfuscate their tracks, maybe because they're coming up with more creative cyber operations, maybe because they're limited in terms of resources. We don't really know what the answer is, but it is a fact that now they're working together. So we could expect similar types of scenarios against the United States as well during the midterm elections. Also, what we have observed is that in the disinformation space, or in the way the Russian government spreads strategic narratives, there is also this diffusion between state and non-state actors at the moment. Ever since Ukraine started, or the war in Ukraine started, or basically intensified again, because there has been a war since 2014, but ever since it intensified in February, a lot of countries have closed down Russian state-sponsored media outlets. And as a result, the Russian government has come up with more creative ways to spread disinformation and strategic narratives, and is using now the official accounts of Russian politicians and the official accounts of Russian embassies to amplify narratives from non-state actors or fake personas that are spreading disinformation that is positive of Russia. So this is I would say one tactic that we may also observe during the elections. And of course, protests. The Russian government is very well known to have subsidized, either financed or influenced in other ways different protests in the United States, but also in other countries. And I would expect them to try to do that again. So I think this may be my last slide. Yes, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions. And this is the book that I wrote. It's based on my PhD at the Rand Corporation, and it has the case studies that I showed you and a few others. So if you're interested, feel free to purchase it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lilly. So, very interesting presentation. I would now like to ask you a couple of questions pertaining to the upcoming midterm elections. First of all, we can see that Russia has been particularly active on different platforms, spreading disinformation and fomenting anger, especially on social media, of course. If we look at the US, though, we can see as well that lots of people, sometimes even traditional media, latch on to this disinformation and treats it as face value. How do we address the domestic dimension of disinformation? Can we really distinguish and treat it separately? Or should we, on the contrary, consider that solutions to foreign disinformation can only start from the domestic aspect?
That's a great question. I would say it has to be a multi-layered approach, and there is a domestic aspect, and it's pretty important that we address it. Germany, I think, had a good policy that they introduced to try to effectively tackle this. In 2017, the German government introduced a law that basically stipulated that social media companies can be fined up to $50 million or 50 million euro if they allow illegal content on their networks. And there were two distinctions: if they allow the content to be on their networks for more than 24 hours, and then or up to 7 days. So in this way, they created a regulation with actual costs for social media, domestic social media, or social media that spreads messages in Germany. And I think that is one way to tackle disinformation, to create regulation. That's one aspect of it. Another is, I think it is important to also recognize that we have to train, and we have to continue to train. We've already done this for a while, but to continue to train the media journalists and in general other representatives or hosts in media channels, specifically the major ones, about the pernicious effects of spreading state-sponsored disinformation or state-sponsored strategic narratives, especially when it is not the state they're representing. So I think raising awareness can be very helpful, especially when it is paired with some sort of government regulation that imposes costs on not following through or not really representing accurate information on your platforms.
Thank you very much. So I think it's a safe bet to say that foreign influence will continue after the midterms. You had a pretty safe, educated guess, like you said, about what was going on right now. What do you expect to see after the midterms? What patterns do you think we're going to be able to observe, depending, of course, on the party that comes out as the winner of those elections?
Based on past Russian tactics and what types of narratives they've spread, I would say if the Republicans win, then it is beneficial for the Russian government because of their potential criticism against and skepticism against U.S. aid for Ukraine. If the Democrats win, if the Democrats win the House, I think then we will see a lot more information about fraudulent elections, a lot more information about corrupt democratic representatives. But if the Republicans win, probably we will see less information, specifically sponsored from the Russian government, less information, less narratives, or fewer narratives about the elections being fraudulent, because it is in Russia's interest for those representatives to be in office. But I think that we'll see more and more, we have already seen that, but I guess a continuation of the narrative that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is justified, that Ukrainians are Nazis, and all of this is fake. I just want to make sure that no one quotes me out of context here. And we'll see a lot more, or at least a continuation of the narratives that aid from the United States for Ukraine is being used in corrupt ways, that is not really going in the right direction, that aid shouldn't even be sent to the Ukrainian military and government. I think we'll see a lot more of that, or at least a continuation of that narrative.
You said, well, you showed us that from what we could see from the U.S. and from France as well, that after the election, foreign influence campaigns were more important. There was more disinformation after than before. Do you think that, for example, if the Republicans win the House, do you think that there will be less disinformation, or you expect it to see the same trend as what you observed in 2016 in U.S., for example?
Danny, with regards to state-sponsored media, I think it's hard to say what the volume would be. I could tell you what the narratives would be, because even in my analysis, I analyze only the overt, and this is really important. I'm analyzing only the overt volume of strategic messaging, but we also have social media. We have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have other platforms where the Russian government clearly has interest in spreading narratives, and I didn't identify or try to measure the volume of that, but I think of that strategic messaging campaign, and I think we have to, in order to combine the two. And I didn't measure it because in the US it may be easier to obtain the data sets with that data, but in some of the other cases that I looked at, it was absolutely impossible to get the data that I needed to analyze those campaigns. So I would say on social media, on official Russian state-sponsored media channels, probably yes, based on what I have found. We may see an increase in the volume of strategic messaging, but with regards to social media, I wouldn't be able to say because I haven't analyzed those narratives. But because the war continues to progress, because it is becoming more and more, well, it is already a very important issue for the Russian government, it will continue to be a priority. I envision, at least in the next few months, I would expect the volume to either go up or stay the same.
Thank you. Besides Russia, we know that other countries such as Iran and China have been trying to meddle in the US electoral process in the last couple of years. What can you tell us about these countries? Do they follow the same patterns of activity? Do they seem to have the same goals as Russia?
That's a great question. So initially we didn't think so, right? Until a few years ago, whenever someone is going to analyze election interference in the United States or Western states, I'll just focus on Western states because China has been influencing or trying to influence elections in its neighborhood, which is separate from what I have been analyzing. But earlier we tend to say that the Chinese government is more interested in economic espionage, and they weren't really interested in influencing the elections in a way that would sway the elections in favor of one candidate over the other, or they were not really interested in eroding the democratic process. But as of late, and especially I'm going to mention again Mandiant, because yesterday or the day before, and we talked about this also, communicate on Twitter, Mandiant disclosed another document with another campaign from a Chinese state-sponsored actor that clearly showed that now the Chinese government is also interested in influencing the outcome of the election, or at least eroding, or actually both, eroding the trust in the democratic system in the US. And what was really interesting in that report for me was that the Mandiant team discovered that the Chinese were also were spreading narratives about that were trying to dissuade the US electorate from voting, which is what the Russians also did in 2016. So now the Chinese are clearly interested in influencing the political outcome, or the election outcome in this case. So we have the Chinese government now also actively participating and aggressively trying to interfere in the election process. The Iranians are also pretty interesting and potentially present a threat to the elections. I don't think this time we have similar knowledge of their activities yet, but I know from the previous election that Iranians have tried to breach the networks of basically, they have been not only behind disinformation operations and strategic messaging campaigns, they have also launched cyber operations against election infrastructure, specifically voter registration records, and they managed to at least impact one voter registration record, but they have not influenced they haven't influenced ballots, they haven't really breached or haven't really hacked into voter machines, so they haven't really influenced the election process or the election outcome, but they have breached the voter registration registry at least once. So we have that we have the Iranians involved in both disinformation, strategic messaging, and cyber operations.
Thank you. I have a tough one for you. Last August, the analysis company Graphica published a report exposing a vast influence campaign believed to have been handled by actors established in the U.S., and there have been suspicion that the U.S. government might have played a role in this campaign. So far, it seems that we in the West have been rather reluctant to use this information and foreign influence because it is seen as a treacherous enterprise. Do you think the West is now considering or even starting to join the disinformation game? And if so, do you think this is a good idea, at least strategically speaking?
I'm not speaking on behalf of the US government. just I want to start with that. So Micah McCutcheon, who is the COO of the Krebs Stamos Group, said to me, we've discussed this issue several times, and Micah said, you cannot fight lies with lies. And I want to credit him for this phrase because it's very elegant, and I can start explaining my position from there. I don't think we can fight lies with lies, but also I think using disinformation as a tool also would discredit us in the long run because it erodes our own reputation as a country that is opposed to that sort of method. On the other hand, this is a whole military domain now. Cyber and information warfare, those are used against us. And I think ceding that entire military domain and saying we're going to take the high road, the high ground, and we're not going to use that sort of narrative ever is also naive. But I think in very limited circumstances, this may be justified, such as if we have to capture terrorists, if we have to somehow use them in very extreme circumstances. But what has to happen is that we have to have a clear code of ethics on the basis of which the US government very publicly articulates under what conditions this information will be justified. And those have to be very limited. I don't endorse I wouldn't say that we should use this information the way the Russian government or the Chinese government is using it to influence the elections of foreign nations, not at all. But we have to have a doctrine that clearly explains under what conditions and what scenarios this is allowed, and also explains clearly what this information is. Because how about sarcasm? If I'm the US government, and we know that it's pretty effective because we see NAFO and the Ukrainian government itself tweeting a lot about Russian cyber attacks, and I look at those tweets and I pay attention. But sarcasm is also not factually accurate, or it doesn't have to be. So what do we call that? So I think there has to be a study and a very clearly articulated doctrine where we explain what is allowed and what's not allowed.
Dr. Lilly, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and I hope we will see you in Montreal again in the future. Once more, I want to extend my deepest appreciation to the staff of the Cher Raoul-Dandurand, who made this conference possible. Finally, of course, thank you very much to everyone in the public for being here today. There are more events like this one coming in the next couple of days, so we, of course, hope to see you there. So have a nice day to you all.
Thank you.